2023 to be a year of significant declines in inflation, and it's actually our job to make sure that that's the case. But I would tell you that, with inflation headline.
Hello, welcome to
PCE
Financial
inflation is
Stockholm.
running about
I'm
5%
Christopher
for
Crystal.
October
Today is
basis
Friday,
core
February
inflation.
24th, 2023. And this is what we see, or we've been seeing in the news regarding Scandinavia, Sweden, and Europe as well. And these are our views and what our thoughts are. But for the investment advice and strategies in the market, that you should be consulting your own investment advisor with. But we're giving you information that we're seeing and possibly could influence your decision. And that's why you should talk with your investment advisor. And you can ask the questions about some of the topics we're raising. So right now in Sweden, it's been a bit of a tough week. We have companies that are struggling. We've gone through the majority of the earnings or done with the earnings. And we see that the large corporations with a lot of office space are having difficulty staffing their offices. Some of the former rising stars don't have so many people going to the office. You have a lot of people working 2-3 days from home or longer periods of time working from home. And so the question about office space is becoming an issue. And so that will also affect other chains like food chains. These industries require the office personnel to be passing by. So we'll see how that affects them. But in general, the Swedish corporate world has been impacted negatively, especially where you look at the technology side. We had a number of technology areas where the offices were filled, and now they're not as filled. So the vacancy rates are going up. And the question will be, how long will these people continue to hire or rent? I mean, the rate or the office space. Then you see other companies like H&M. It's laying off 1,500 people. That's big news for us. And what's even worse for these people at the H&M is that the date for when when they will stop working is not yet determined. So they're working with a lot of uncertainty, which is not so common here in Sweden, because generally everything is. We like to set things in order and progress, to the point where you can map it out with a spreadsheet. So these people who are working within H&M and don't know when their departure date will be is very unnerving for them, and it creates a bad milieu within the companies. So that's not so good. We also see a little bit of focus on what's happening in the NASDAQ. So the NASDAQ tech world is a heavy influence for us because of the correlation, and we've had a lot of tech companies, Spotify being a good example, and what's happening there. So now Bolt is coming under scrutiny here in Sweden. You've had the stories exposing the salaries within the U.S. And so forth, and that they're going to be raising fees. So Bolt is something that they talk about today. They're also talking about cars like Porsche, or car companies like Porsche, and that's because Porsche is going to go for the e-fuel. Now, there are other companies out there like Polestar, which has already gone for the e-fuel, or if you look at companies like Tesla, which is a local Swedish favorite, but they keep trying to look for the next one. But SAS will also follow suit, that they're going to look for the next e-fuel, and that's because they're admitting that the cost of the kerosene or the jet fuel is too high and very difficult for them to overcome. So the economy overall is very tough. The households are not so strong. The RiksBank is looking at the scenarios and trying to raise rates at the same time as not choke the economy to death. And it is going to have to raise rates. We continue to have high inflation, and that's been set as the target. So we will see probably a 50 basis point move, potentially higher, because if you look at the U.S. figures, that's the leading indicator for how things are going. And U.S. was quote unquote doing better than Europe before. So now with today's figures, those are not looking so good. Something that is relatively good was the trade between Sweden and Norway. The Swedish trade, or the trade between Sweden and Norway, rose 315%. And that was in line with the amount of day trips that Norwegians were making to Sweden, which rose something like 235%. It was over 200% increase And so Norwegians are coming to Sweden because things were cheaper here. And those figures do not include that 10.4 billion NOKs does not include oil and gas. The oil and gas sales were actually down slightly, which is interesting because our fuel cost or our electricity cost were the highest in Europe. And when we didn't have the liquid natural gas, we used oil to make our electricity. So that means we're probably buying our oil from somewhere else in Europe if we weren't buying it from Norway. And so that's a little odd, but that's where we are. And what did stay relatively flat was the fish sales from Norway to Sweden. And something that actually declined was the car rental price between Norway and Sweden. So not really anything important, but something good. And then, but I think also another point to indicate how bad things might get is Germany had a worse than expected GDP figures. Now, I'm not really sure who understood it as worse than expected. When you look at the energy price cost in Germany, you look at the figures from one of their largest employers in the chemicals industry, especially BASF, and they are one of the largest employers, period, for Germany, but they're also one of the largest in the chemicals, or the largest in chemicals for Germany. And they have about 50,000 employees they've had to lay off, or they've made announcements that they're going to have layoffs. They had these increased costs because of energy prices that were spiking. So with the insolvencies of smaller businesses and the average consumer being forced to consume less and buy less, it's no surprise that German GDP was lower than anticipated. So you really have to wonder who is making the forecast or who is saying it's worse than expected. I mean, what kind of economists are these? But obviously they're probably Frankfurt School as opposed to Austrian. So therefore, you can understand why they can't really understand economics. So what else we're seeing in Sweden? We have a continued split between the government and the parties involved, or the government and the coalition. So, and I say that because the Swedish Democrats, who were the ones who got us a right-led government, are not part of the quote unquote government, they're part of the coalition. So the members of the government are the Liberal Party, the Moderaterna Party, and the Christian Democrats. So those people are taking government positions or minister positions, whereas the Swedish Democrats are taking other positions, but also helping us to have this coalition where we'd have a right-led government. And they're going to be auditing the Swedish television and Swedish radio. And so this is part of the culture war. And so the question of what kind of programming these companies are buying, how they're spending their money. So there'll be an audit and a review of what's being financed, what's being brought to the Swedish citizen through the government money, and perhaps what isn't. There's a debate about the culture. And if you look more to the to America and the problems that they're going through with the culture wars, that's what's happening here in Sweden. And so that's why you have this review, and we'll see what happens there. And then we within our society we do have a significant amount of corruption that's being exposed. And for instance, we had this police corruption that was exposed back at the end of last year, where a Swedish police chief, she was promoted because of the relationship, the sexual relationship she had with the head of police, and he had gotten her promoted and got her special privileges that she wasn't qualified for, like being armed at the office and having a weapon. So he, being the chief of police, he had to leave, and he was going to be charged with different crimes. And given his, possible prison sentence, he killed himself. So we're under a situation of morale issue within the police. Many people are wondering why the police aren't doing more to prevent crime. A lot of the crime or criminality is being perpetrated in specific areas, and many are wondering how long it's going to take before the police can curb this problem. The police are talking about the gang criminality, and many people are seeing the gangs attacking each other, and these are all drug warfare. And there are a lot of the crimes are being committed against the rival gangs, so it's gang on gang violence. But you are seeing people being robbed, people being assaulted. These things are increasing at an alarming rate, and much of our Swedish society is being lost. So that happening, where this woman, Linda Staff, who had been promoted to a high-level police officer position, and then being given a gun without having ever done weapons qualification or having gone to police school, it was a violation of the law. And remember, in Sweden, if you have a hunting license and you have a gun and you break the speed limit and you get a speeding ticket, you could actually lose your right to own a gun. So it's taken very seriously, the role of a gun and who can own it. So we'll see what develops out of this. There was an investigation done into this and written up, and you can find that PDF on the police website, and the recommendations that they suggest. But the treatment of the two officers was radically different. One was forced to resign, one resigned of her own free will. So, we'll leave it at that. And, some of the banking scandals that we've had, you had this Swedbank CEO, she had to testify and she was potentially going to go to jail, and she didn't go to jail. So she got through that. And that was involving money laundering and what was happening there, and where the money was being laundered. By the way, that involved Ukraine. But so when we speak about Ukraine, and we talk about the war that's going on, which is terrible, we may be moving closer to peace talks, or we could be further away and closer to a nuclear winter than ever. China's calling for peace talks. They want Russia and the Ukraine to resume communications. They would also like to see a cessation of the weaponization of global trade. So sanctions should also not be unilaterally decided, meaning the U.S. should not be the ones pulling the trigger constantly and saying, we're going to sanction this country or that country or these companies. So like, for instance, today, the U.S. has sanctioned Russian aluminum. And that, by the way, should be good for us in the Nordics, because Norsk Hydro is an aluminum producer, and they had moved away from the aluminum last year because the pricing. And so now, with the shortage of supply, well, I guess hydro can start producing again. We'll see what happens. And they could actually make a profit on it. But China has called for this, especially after Russia has said they're leaving the START treaty. And now we do have Jens Stoltenberg saying that you can't take China seriously, which I find to be a very bold statement. And it's alarming, to say the least. However, you do have an Italian military saying it's well worth heeding what China is saying, and we should listen to, at least listening to them and considering what they're saying. So all this is going on while Biden was just in the Ukraine. Today there was another conference call with them and the G20. So with Zelensky and the G20 to discuss how to move forward. The U.S. is training Ukrainian mechanized units in the army. You're seeing tank missiles or anti-tank missiles from Iran to Russia, so that Russia can use these against the Leopard tanks that are being sent to them. We're sending a few of those, by the way, and we're sending rocket systems, and we're sending also other troop transports. And then we're also looking at B-52s have been sighted flying over Tallinn. And I mentioned already that we're sending over these tanks and troop carriers. Things are heating up, and we'll see what happens over the weekend. But there are quite a few people who are worried about nuclear war, and with what's happened recently, it's no real surprise. And so, but in the Swedish press, we are seeing criticism or critique offered about how the sanctions are working, and that it has not done anything to the Russian economy. And so it's not impacted Russia the way people had thought. And that, remember, Russia is selling the oil and the gas to India. India is doing the refining and then selling it to Europe. So they're selling it to India. India is selling it to Europe, and Europe has used this to fill up their natural gas reserves. But that means Russia is still getting the money for the trade, and Russia is not going to sell to Europe. And if it does sell to Europe, it's going to force them to trade in rubles. It's not going to trade in euros, and it's not going to trade in dollars. And they've already said that their wealth fund will not have anything other than rubles and yuan and gold and silver and maybe a couple other currencies, but not the euro and not the dollar. So that will help elevate the price of the ruble if anybody wants to trade with Russia. So we'll see what happens. But with this sanction of aluminum, remember, Russia was only selling about $650 million worth of aluminum to the US. So we'll see where they're going to buy the aluminum from, who they're going to source it from. Norsk Hydro should certainly be happy to see that 650 is out of the market, so to speak, and it's good news for them. Smelters in Norway may also benefit from this because many of them had been forced to close or were not producing so much because of the cost. So we're moving closer to not so many good things, but maybe we're moving closer to peace talks. Maybe we're moving closer to a war, and we do see an increased focus on EFG, or ESG, excuse me, where like I said, SAS and the BMW are looking at doing e-fuels. And so another thing is SAB, Saab got a bigger order onto their balance sheets of 8 billion Swedish crown. And this is for munitions. This is not for the planes. India, by the way, is buying planes from Russia. So if you think about it in terms of a global population, Russia has about 145 million people. China has 1.4 billion, right? So that makes 1.5, almost 1.6 in total billion people that are in their viewpoint of what Russia has done in Ukraine and not having the same viewpoint as we have. And then if you look at India, in India holding line with Russia as well, then you're looking closer to, you're well over 2 billion at this point. You're closer to 3+ billion people in the world. Now remember, there's 8 billion people in the world that are, so if you're looking at 3 to 4 billion, because if you look to Africa and what they've had to suffer through in terms of food rationing as a result of the Ukrainian war and the sanctions that were imposed, and this is something that China is saying that should be regulated and back to normalization of the grain trade, you're looking at a scenario where you have close to 4 billion people or more disagreeing with the United States and Europe. So where we have 660 million people, or let's say 700 million people, versus 4 billion people. So if you're into democracies, well, that's not very democratic that we would go against 4 billion people. So if we can get to a peace talks sooner rather than later, that would be great. But at this point, the war cost is being primarily handled by the U.S. The U.S. is giving or committed to giving Ukraine 120 billion in the past year. So in 12 months, they've committed to 120 billion. They signed up for another 10 billion just yesterday. And Europe has only given 10 billion. So when you look at the good Uncle Sammy and what he's doing of 120 billion versus Europe's 10 billion, it's a question of how much longer do we continue on this war pace, and at what point do we agree that we need to have some sort of negotiations? Because remember, people are dying in both Ukraine. They're both Russian and Ukrainian citizens, and you have mercenaries that have died. So those are people from US, other parts of Europe, and other parts of the world that are dying in this. And you have this Wagner group, which has been, they took troops from the prisons. And so they obviously don't really want those people to survive. There was 40,000 people. And so this is a very inhumane war. And we really need to see some sort of discussion, at least starting. And this is right now a market of perception rather than actual fundamentals. So if you look at what's been happening in Europe, the idea has been that inflation is being tamed and that the rate hikes are having some sort of effect. Now, when we get the consumer price spending index in the US out today, that gives the indication that things are not progressing at the speed at which people thought. So the inflation is not being tamed. You are going to have an increase in rates. And so the idea of 25 basis point hikes in the US now looks closer to 50 basis points or possibly 75. And in Europe, we're looking at 50, possibly more. We'll see what's happening. But the real fear right now is on stagflation. So today's markets took a downturn after the US figures were given out. The webpage for where you can get these the index is included in the notes. And I've also included the webpage for the Norwegian figures. You can find those as well. And you can go through them. Some of them are fun. But in general, we're getting a market of perception rather than fundamentals. And so the perception is that the inflation was being tamed, and therefore the rate hikes were going to continue slowly and steady, so that the consumer could adjust to it. But the reality is that the central banks are not necessarily in control. And so when you set a fire in the forest to control the forest fire, you're never in control of fire. You can only do what's called a prescribed burn. And right now, this is a prescribed rate hike. We're not really sure how to control the economy. And so we're looking at a scenario that the central banks may actually deflate the economy as opposed to deflate the inflation. And so that would lead to stagflation. And that's why the economy or why the market is moving south right now, because there's a feared perception that we're possibly moving too fast for our own good. And so we'll see what happens. But in general, I think the rate hikes are going to be around 50 basis point. And I think you're going to see a continued possible decrease in the inflation. We need to see the logistic supplies come into line. So you need to see the supply chain getting fixed. In the US, they're having more difficulties with that because of the continued problems with the rail. They didn't pay the workers on the rail strike the right amount. They didn't give them the time off. They didn't give them the sick leave. And then you have these accidents. And then you have comments from the Secretary of Transportation saying there's over 1,000 rail derailings per annum. And that to me is a very high figure on a system that should be fairly contained, and you should have next to zero derailments. I mean, it's just to me impossible to think. But then again, when you look at why they derail, there are easy solutions, and this is a problem that's been going on over 3 administrations. So the Obama administration had done something, and then Trump administration backed away, and then the Biden administration did not immediately jump in to fix it when he had been a part of the previous administration with Obama, and could have done it where they could fix it, or at least would have known about it. But again, they don't do anything to fix it because the lobbyists don't want it going through. So it's a difficult scenario to say has been fixed, and that's the supply chain. And I think that'll be the next key, the linchpin on the coming inflation figures and coming rate hikes. So with that, I wish you a great weekend, and we'll see you next week. But remember, hopefully you're liked, subscribed, and you're going to talk to your investment advisor for any strategy, because in any market you can make money, whether it's an upswing or a downswing, and whether you should be long or whether you should be short. You should be strategic, or so whether you're having the long-term or temporary allocation, these are issues you should be discussing with your investment advisor, and we're just giving you some of the news. So with that, well, thank you very much, and hope you have a great weekend. Thank you. Bye. you.